Was it a mistake for the United States to invade Afghanistan in 2001, 20 years ago?
Yes.
As simple as yes. Why was it a mistake?
I'm an historian, so I say this with, some humility about what we can know. I think, I'd still like to know much more about what was going on in the White House, in the hours, days, weeks, after 9/11. But I think the George W. Bush administration acted in a state of panic. And I think they wanted to show kind of toughness. They wanted to show some kind of resolve. This was a horrific act that played out, on everyone's television screens. And I think it was really fundamentally a crisis of legitimacy within the White House, within the Oval Office. And I think they felt like they had to do something and something dramatic. I think they didn't really think through, who they were fighting, who the enemy was, what this geography had to do with 9/11. I think looking back at it, I mean, some of us, not to say I was, clairvoyant or could see into the future, but I think many of us were, from that morning, skeptical about the connections that people were drawing between Afghanistan as a state, as a place, and the actions of Al Qaeda in Washington and New York and Pennsylvania.
So as you watch the events of 9/11, the things that our leaders were saying in the minutes, hours, days, weeks that followed, maybe you can give a little bit of a timeline of what was being said. When was the actual invasion of Afghanistan? And also, what were your feelings in the minutes, weeks after 9/11?
I was in DC. I was, on the way to American University, hearing on NPR what had happened. And I thought of the American University logo, which is red, white, and blue. It's an eagle. And I thought, Washington is under attack and symbols of American power are under attack. And so, I was quite concerned, and at the time lived, just a few miles from the Capitol. And so, I felt that, it was real. So I appreciate the sense of anxiety and fear and panic. And for 2-3 years later in DC, we were constantly getting reports, mostly rumors and unconfirmed, about all kinds of attacks that would befall the city. So I definitely appreciate the sense of being under assault. But in watching television, including Russian television that day, because I just installed a satellite thing, so I was trying to watch world news and get different points of view, and that was quite useful to have an alternative, set of eyes.
In Russian?
Yeah, in Russian. Yeah.
Okay, so your Russian is good enough to understand Russian television.
The news, the news and the visuals that were coming that were not shown on American television. Mm-hmm. I don't know how they had it, but they were not filtering anything in the way that the major networks and cable televisions were doing here. So it was a very unvarnished view of the violence of the moment, in New York City, of people diving from the towers or being, and it was really, they didn't hold back on that, which was quite, fascinating. I think much of the world saw much more than actually the American public saw. But to your question, amid that feeling of imminent doom, I watched commentators start to talk about Al Qaeda and then talk about Afghanistan. And one of the experts was Barnett Rubin, who's at NYU, who's a kind of long, very learned Afghanistan hand, and he's brought on Peter Jennings on ABC News to kind of lay this out for everyone. And I thought, he did a fine job, but I think it was formative in cementing the view that somehow Al Qaeda was synonymous with this space, Afghanistan. And I think, again, I was no Al Qaeda expert then, and I'm not now, but I think my immediate thought went to war, and because my background had been with, at that point, mostly Afghans who had been displaced from decades of war, whom I encountered in Uzbekistan, who were refugees and so on, I thought immediately, my mind went to the suffering of Afghan people, that this war was going to sweep up, of course, the defenseless people who have nothing to do with these politics.
So we should give maybe a little bit of context that you can speak to.
Yeah.
So assume nobody's an expert at anything.
Yeah.
So let's just say you and I are not experts at anything.
Right.
What, as a historian, were you studying at the time and thinking about? So, is it the full global history of Afghanistan? Is it the region? Were you thinking about the Mujahideen and Al Qaeda and Taliban? Were you thinking about the Soviet Union, the proxy war through Afghanistan? Were you thinking about Iraq and oil? Like what's the full space of things in your heart, in your mind at the time?
I mean, just at the moment, of course, it was, there's the sense of, the suffering and the tragedy of the moment of the deaths, and that was, I think, I was preoccupied by the violence of the moment. But as the conversation turned to Afghanistan as a kind of theater to somehow respond to this moment, I think immediately what came to mind was that the little I knew about Al Qaeda at the time suggested that the geography was inaccurate, that this was a global network, a global threat, that this was a kind of a movement that went beyond borders. And I think it felt early on that Afghanistan was going to be used as a scapegoat. And just intellectually at the time, I was teaching at American University. My courses, touched on a range of subjects, but I was trying to complete a book on Islam and the Russian Empire, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing that research, which took me across Russia and Central Asia, purely by accident, I had developed an interest in Afghanistan because just, again, a series of coincidences. I found myself in Tashkent, the capital of Uzbekistan, without housing, through an American friend who was like the king of the market in Tashkent. He knew everyone. He run into some Afghan merchants there. They found out I didn't have a place to live. I didn't know where Afghanistan was, honestly. This was 1997. I had a vague idea it was next door.
Well, you lived in Uzbekistan?
Yeah, in Tashkent, doing dissertation research. Yeah, because it was hub of the Russian Empire in Central Asia.
Yeah.
So just by accident, I ended up with these young Afghans who took me in as roommates. And that, I think, that the sense of that community shaped my idea of what Afghanistan is. It was my first exposure to them. They were part of a trading diaspora. They had brought matches from Riga, Latvia. They had somehow brought flour and some agricultural products from Egypt. And they were sitting in closed containers in Tashkent waiting for the Uzbekistani state to permit them to trade. So these guys are mostly hanging out during the day. They would get dressed up. They would put on suits and ties like you're wearing. Mm-hmm. They'd polish their shoes. And they would sit around offices, drink tea, pistachios. Then they'd feast at lunch. And then at night, we would go out. So part of my research, because I also had a bottleneck in my research, I was going to the state archives in Tashkent. Mm-hmm. And because of the state of Uzbekistan, that was a very kind of suspicious thing to do. So it took a while to get in. So I had downtime in Tashkent, just like these guys. So I got to know them pretty well. And it was really just an accidental kind of thing, but grew quite close to them. And I developed an appreciation of, which now I think, again, thinking of the seeds of all this, these people had already lived, young guys, in their 20s, they'd already lived in 6 or 7 countries. They all spoke half a dozen languages. One of my best friends there had been a kickboxer and breakdancer, trained in Tehran. His father was a theater person in Afghanistan. He told stories of escaping death in Afghanistan during the Civil War, going to Uzbekistan, escaping death there. And these were very, real stories.
Can you also just briefly mention, geographically speaking,
yes,
Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, you mentioned Iran.
Right.
Who are the neighbors of all of this? What are we supposed to be thinking about for people? I was always terrible at geography and spatial information. So can you lay it out?
No, sure. So Tashkent, is the capital of Uzbekistan. It was a hub of Russian imperial power in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. The Russians take the city from a local kind of Muslim dynasty in 1865. It becomes the city, the kind of hub of Soviet power in Central Asia after 1917. It becomes the center of the Soviet Republic of Uzbekistan, which becomes independent finally in 1991 when the Soviet Union collapses.
So these are all like these republics are the fingertips of Soviet power in Central Asia.
That's right. And they've been independent since 1991, but they have struggled to disentangle themselves from Moscow, from one another. And now they face very serious pressure from China to form a kind of periphery of, the great machine that is the Chinese economy and its ambitions to stretch across Asia. For Afghanistan, where my roommates, my friends hailed from, Afghanistan had fallen into civil war in the late 1970s when leftists tried to seize power there in 1978. The Soviet Union then extended from Uzbekistan, crossing the border with its forces in 1979 to try to shore up this leftist government that had seized power in 1978. And so for Central Asians in the wider region, their fate had for some decades been tied to Afghanistan in a variety of ways. But it became much more connected in the 1980s when the Soviet Red Army occupied Afghanistan for 10 years. And here I refer your listeners and viewers to Rambo 3 as the guide to
The historically accurate
the historically
guide
accurate,
to
the
the
Bible,
occupation of
the Bible of
Afghanistan.
Afghan history in Rambo 3, yeah.
Yeah.
As a fantastic window onto the American view of the war, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for most Afghans, there are people who fought against the Soviet army, but of a certain generation, the guys I knew, their mission was to survive. And so they fled in waves, by the millions to Pakistan, to Iran. Some went north into Soviet Central Asia later in the 1990s. And some were displaced across the planet. So California, where we're sitting today, has a large community that came in the 80s and 90s in the East Bay.